Hello and welcome back. This is the second episode of our epic series with Dr. Akbar Ahmed, a scholar of great repute and standing, an anthropologist, a professor, a civil servant, a diplomat, and an author. Above all, an inquiring mind who has looked into our past and is very much engaged with the present. Dr. Akbar Ahmed, welcome back. And
Thank you.
today, and today we are going to follow up on our earlier discussion, viewers, which was on the golden age of Islam or the golden age of Muslims, the spirit of inquiry, knowledge, learning, discovery, scientific engagement, and then how this particular age declined and paved the way for the emergence of three different empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, in different parts of what we call now the world of Muslims or Islamic world or whatever. There are different terminologies employed by historians. But before that, Dr. Ahmed, I would like you to speak about another very major and important figure, Ibn Khaldun, who is the founder, if I may say so, of modern discipline of history and historiography. And his seminal work on the rise and decline of civilizations has informed scholars and scholarship for centuries. So if you can briefly talk a bit about Ibn Khaldun, then we can get into these three
Yes,
empires.
yes. Thank you, Raza, and thank you for um, initiating the second discussion we are having, because I think this series should be able to create a lot of interest in people who are interested in these subjects. History is not a dead subject. It's not in the past only. It has an impact on our lives. And through this series, I'm hoping that there'll be a further interest in these subjects. So let's start with Ibn Khaldun, who is one of the giants of history, not just a Muslim giant, world giant. And I can quote you many Western social scientists and philosophers who absolutely admire him and are astounded by the scale of his intellectual achievements. Toynbee, the great historian, the great British historian, who said that Ibn Khaldun's work, nowhere in history can anyone match anything written by Ibn Khaldun. He's just above everything. That's Toynbee paying tribute to him. So Ibn Khaldun had the great advantage, Raza, if you look at his life, that he worked in Andalusia, which he saw as declining. So Andalusia is declining, and he saw the days of the Muslim empires and dynasties in Andalusia were numbered. So he was seeing the decline there. Then he moved to North Africa. And again, he saw a lot of turmoil and decline. In fact, at one stage, the local ruler caught him and put him in prison. And to his credit, he was a scholar like you, Raza. He never gave up. He continued writing in prison. I think scholars have to remember that. And he then escaped from there, moved from along North Africa to Cairo, where his ship, he had a shipwreck, he lost all his books. But again, that Muslim world then from Spain right up to Central Asia was culturally homogeneous. It was one. It may have been politically divided, but there was a sense of one world civilization. So a man could start from Andalusia and in Egypt be given the job of a qazi, a top judge in Cairo, and that's where he ended up. Of course, he went for the Hajj and went to Makkah Sharif, Medina Sharif. He went up to Damascus. So he moved around, but that is where he ended his days. His theory is very interesting because in the social sciences, he did two or three things which are still very much relevant to us. Number one, he used material outside his area of interest. So he used examples from tribal societies, urban societies, Greek societies, cross-culture. He took examples from the past and used them and applied them. And he presented a theory. Before him, historians would say countries rise and fall because the king was good or the king was virtuous or the king was healthy. Ibn Khaldun said, no, there's a science here. There's a science to the rise and fall of dynasties and empires. And this is something I think we should be very alert to. And he said that if societies that come down from the mountains and deserts are united and have a sense of communal spirit, he called it asabiya, then societies are strong and they can withstand and resist any pressures around them. They come down fresh, vigorous, and they conquer settled tribes, settled peoples, especially those in the cities. But over time, over 3 generations, in turn, they become soft and effete, the word used for this decadence, and in turn, they are vulnerable to a new wave. So this cycle is about 3 to 4 generations, but it is in motion. So he presented a very interesting, a dynamic theory of history. And you can see this in a sense in the subject we are covering, because we talked about the golden age of Islam, which sort of ended in 13th, 14th centuries. And he was at the tip of this, because right at the end of his this 14th, 15th century, you have the Mongols destroying much of this Muslim world. And then the re-emergence, the Arabs are sort of moved out of history, off the center stage, and the emergence of 3 great empires, which we will discuss today. So as you pointed out, the 3 empires are the Ottomans, the Safavid, and then to the east, the Mughals. And
Right.
the first characteristic, Raza, of these 3 empires is that they were genuinely 3 great superpowers. At that time, there's no America, there's no North America, South America, no Australia, no Japan and Korea superpowers. These are the 3 great superpowers. So if John Mearsheimer, who wrote his famous thesis on the great powers and the great power rivalries today, in which he discussed the US, China, and Russia as the 3 great powers, and he said India is an emerging power. If he were alive then and he were writing, he would select precisely these 3 powers that we are discussing: the Ottomans, the Safavid, and the Mughals. So let's take a look at these, and I'll try to give you a brief characteristic of this entire body, the 3 empires. So first of all, what strikes you is their vastness, the scale that we are talking about. We are used to talking about the Roman Empire. Each one of these empires is larger than the Roman Empire. So think of the scale. This is a stretch. These are the 3 Muslim empires stretching from Spain on one side of their globe right up to Samarkand on the other, from north, and Samarkand down to Yemen in the south. So it's really a global empire. And the time period, these aren't short-lived empires that come into existence and disappear. These empires stretch over centuries. The longest of them, of course, is the Ottomans, who start in the 1300 and end in 1922, when Ataturk abolishes the Sultanate. So there's no longer the Sultan, who was the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. So think of that span. This is the longest dynasty in world history, the Ottomans. The Safavids are probably the shortest, and the Mughals, of course, are midway between the two. But Mughals, as we know, then in 1857 with the mutiny, they are finally removed. In 1857, Muslims' rule comes to an end, and Muslims lose an emperor, an empire, a capital, Delhi, and the world is changed for them. So these are the 3 empires in brief. What are their characteristics? Scale was one. Number 2, each one, as I see it, had an obsession, a psychological obsession. I'm a historian, not a psychiatrist, but it's easy to see their obsession. The Europeans were confronting the Ottomans. This was a constant battle between them, constant to and fro. And the Ottomans were obsessed with the Christian West. So everything was done in terms of a zero-sum situation. And to the point that when Sinan, the great Ottoman architect, it's one of the great tourist attractions, he made sure that the minaret was 16 feet higher than Saint Sophia, which was the great cathedral, the church which the Ottomans captured and converted into a mosque. So it was that kind of rivalry. And who was Sinan? And many other figures like Sinan. They were actually Christians, because the Ottomans had a system where they would take young Christian boys, convert them to Islam or allow them to grow up in a Muslim milieu, but then absorb them into the administration, and they had the possibility of going and ascending to the highest positions in the state. Literally, they could become commander-in-chief, they could become wazir, they could become whatever. As long as they didn't challenge the Sultan, they had access to the highest positions. And they did. They served the state and they served Islam very, very passionately and faithfully. So this example can be repeated in the other two. The Safavid had a certain characteristic, which was that initially they were mixed. You had Sunnis and Shias, and they lived comfortably. But once the Safavid took power, and the Safavids were coming from a Sufi order, they
Right.
they instituted the Shia faith in a very strong and unequivocal manner. So the Persian Empire, the Persians, the Iranian, that entire region became Shia. And then the Sunnis were persecuted, either they converted or had to leave, because that they became very vigorously aware that for them the world was Shia versus Sunni. So while the Ottomans had this obsession with Christianity, the Safavid had this obsession with Sunni Islam. And again, you have to understand their position. They were wedged in between the Ottomans on one side, who were Sunni, and the Uzbeks on the other side, who were also Sunni. So they always felt a sense of claustrophobia. They're caught between the two Sunni wedges. And there was this constant tension and battle between them. Then, of course, you had the Mughals. And as we know from that part of the world, that the Mughals had their own obsession, and that was the presence of the overwhelming presence of the Hindu population, which was always a majority population. So how do they deal with the Hindus? You had Akbar the Great dealing with them in one way, and you had his descendant Aurangzeb dealing with them in another way, in a much more aggressive and a counterproductive way. So those were the different approaches to the Hindu population, but it was there. It was a reality. It could not be ignored. So that was another. Now, I pointed out that while they were tolerant, this was a vast empire, they also had a great passion for art and architecture and beauty. So people sometimes overlook this because they dismiss them as, well, there's just another empire. They created some brilliant art. So if you see the miniatures of the Safavid, for example, you see the art of the Ottomans in their great mosque, the Blue Mosque, the Suleymania. You see the Mughals, the Taj Mahal, the Shalimar Gardens, the Jami Masjid in Delhi. These are stunning pieces of architecture, which we, half a millennium later, 500 years later, we look at these and we are astonished at their beauty and their perfection. So they were great artists, these dynasties and empires. And they were this another characteristic I find of all three. And it's very interesting because I find that at their height, and I would say that for all three, the height came between the 15th and the 17th century. So between the 15th and the 17th century, two or three things are happening on the world stage. Western powers have not really emerged, and these three are at their height. They're at such a height that the Ottomans are actually attacking Europe, and they're at the gates of Vienna. Just think of it. They're at the gates of one of the major cities of Europe. That's how bold they are. Akbar, as we know, is ruling what is now effectively India. So he's got Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, all these under what was then Mughal India. And the Safavid, of course, don't underestimate what they were doing, because they had this whole region from east of Iran, north of Iran, right down to the Gulf, up to Bahrain and so on. All this was under Iranian influence. So these were three great empires in their day, and their rulers at that time. Another fascinating aspect: they were extraordinary figures. The rulers of these three empires at their height, 15th to 17th century, were larger than life figures. The Ottomans were ruled by Suleiman the Magnificent. He was so great that Western writers writing of him would say he's the Magnificent, Suleiman the Magnificent. Akbar, as we know, is Akbar the Great, the Mughal Emperor. He's so great that when the most famous Bollywood film is made, it's called Mughal Azam. That's Akbar.
Yes.
And people still remember him in terms of being so great. And then, of course, with the Safavid, you had Abbas. Abbas, another very great figure. The same, he's equal to these three, and he's a great patron of art and culture. And it is said that when his favorite calligrapher, Ali Raza, would be doing his work, beautiful work, Abbas, the ruler of the Safavid Empire, would stand there holding a candle, allowing him to see better and do his work. They were great patrons of the arts. Then another interesting characteristic which is common to all three of them, each one of them created a new capital for themselves. So these are men of imagination. They're
Yeah.
warriors, they're artists, but they're also creating their own world. So the Ottomans, of course, capture Constantinople. This is a historic achievement. 1453, Mehmet II, the conqueror, is called the conqueror, still a young man. This event shook the world, shook Europe, shook the Muslim world, because the Muslim world had lost Cordoba just recently, 2 centuries before. And here was Mehmet now conquering Constantinople, which was then renamed Istanbul, Islambul, the city of Islam. That's the interpretation. And Mehmet, of course, was a military genius, because the way he conquered Constantinople is historic, because he actually took his navy and brought it on land. This is unparalleled in military history. He had these huge logs which allowed these ships to be rolled across and attack Constantinople from a vulnerable point, and thus conquer the city. So again, the example of his behavior, he walks into St. Sophia, and it is recorded that he fell to his knees in awe. He was there as a devotee, and he was doing this gesture in devotion to the divine. And he ordered that the statues, the images of Jesus and Mary in the church are not vandalized and not desecrated. They should be put away very respectfully. And he, of course, had the calligraphy of Allah and Muhammad placed in the mosque in the St. Sophia. And that's about all they did. So what you see when you go to these places is that he preserved the historical legacy of St. Sophia. Again, as with Akbar, as we know, he created a new city for himself, which we know is called Fatehpur Sikri. And again, his attitude to non-Muslims. I don't know whether you visited that, Raza, but when you
I
enter,
have. I have been. I've
if
had
you
the
remember
pleasure.
the Baland Darwaza, as you enter Fatehpur Sikri, there is a beautiful saying there of Jesus. And when I saw that, I was just stunned. And my Christian friends were stunned, because they said we had no idea about this. And the saying is a beautiful saying, which is very typical of Hazrat Isa, Jesus. It says that the world is a bridge. Do not build on it, but cross lightly over it. Meaning, don't be too attached to the world, because the world is temporary and it'll go. But do good deeds and be known by your character and your piety. That is what Akbar quotes. So again, think of it. He's the ruler of India. He's the mighty Mughal emperor. Mighty because all three of these rulers had mighty armies backing them. They weren't just promoting peace and therefore attracting people to their cause. These were mighty emperors, warriors. Akbar had an army of several 100,000 warriors, very well trained. He had 50,000 elephants, armor-plated elephants. And these were like tanks. So imagine the firepower that he could bring to any war. And yet, throughout his reign, he had great respect for Hindus and Sikhs. And there are famous stories that when the Sikh pilgrims would come to see him and with the holy book, he would give them gold and weighted against the Guru Granth Sahib, the holy book. He would respect the Hindu pilgrims. He would respect people of different faiths, the rabbis, Christians. And as we know, he had the weekly gatherings in the Ibadat Khana where he would call all these religious figures, and they'd have what we call now interfaith dialogue. So this is Akbar centuries ago. I pointed out the Ottomans, because the Ottoman Empire was always an empire of diversity. It had different cultures, different religions, different people living within it. And that was one reason why it lasted so long. So Ibn Khaldun's thesis of this constant cycle sort of stopped for all three at the time of the greatness of these great charismatic rulers. When these charismatic rulers passed, we began to see the decline. And then what happened is, on the world stage, that in the meantime, Western powers, especially European powers, were emerging. So you had France, England, Germany emerging as powers, and very soon they were looking around the world for countries to conquer, countries to colonize, and make them their own, and that is exactly what happened. So each one of these Muslim empires was chopped up and absorbed, and the Ottomans, who had been the terror of Europe for so long, now in the 17th, 18th century, were really showing signs of decadence. And one of the most terrible examples, it's a very bad example, but I think it's important for people to know. We shouldn't just glamorize the past. The ruler, the Sultan, lived in the Topkapi, which is one of the most amazing
Yes.
palaces
Sentient.
in the world. Turkey, it was the heart of the Ottomans. This is where the Ottoman Emperor Sultan ruled. And it so spread over 30 acres. It overlooked 3 seas. He had, I think it was, his name was Ibrahim, Sultan Ibrahim, 1,200 wives. And at one stage, he was going mad. He was on drugs and he was just living a life of debauchery. He ordered 300 of them to be sewn alive, stitched alive in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus and drowned, like they were cats or some animals. That is one of the worst aspects of so much power in these empires, because people go, really literally, they go mad, as we see in this example. As you've been to the Topkapi, you'll have seen that the lives of these Sultan and his family were really miserable, because they lived in these small cage-like rooms. And when the Sultan was declared the Sultan, every male relative was at that moment killed instantly, so that there would be no threat to the ruler. So very tolerant, except for the king's possible rivals. This was the rule of the, as we know with the Mughals, they always had this war of succession, and that disrupted the empire. So in terms of the big picture, I want to end this introduction by saying that you had these empires as the great presence on the world stage. These were what, as I said, what today we would know as great powers. They had economic wealth, they had military strength, and they had a great reputation in that world. People feared them and people respected them. But over time, like all empires, we come back to Ibn Khaldun and the cycle of history, over time, the empires began to show signs of weakness, and they could not pull back then. Once the decline began for the Ottomans, the decline continued, so it took about 200 years. But as we know that early in the 20th century, they were finished. In the First World War, they sided with the Central Powers, that is Germany and Hungary, and they couldn't resist the Allies, the British and the French. And in the end, they lost. The Germans lost, and with that, their allies, the Turks, lost, the Ottomans. And as a result, the Ottoman Empire was literally chopped up. And hadn't it been for the military genius of Kemal Atatürk, who was then in the army commanding troops, the entire area would have been demolished and distributed. It's Kemal Atatürk, more or less alone, who's responsible for salvaging what remained of became the state of Turkey. So this empire, which at one stage included East Europe and most of North Africa and the Middle East, and stretched over 3 continents, it was now reduced to what is Turkey. But still, I find when I deal with the Turks and read about them, they have that sense of, we've come from this background. We were an empire. We were world conquerors. And that is something which I find very interesting in each one of these empires, because their inheritor states, like the Persians, the Iranians, have the sense of we belong to an ancient civilization, a noble civilization, a great civilization, which gave the world art and culture, and we created societies that were tolerant. And if anyone challenges these statements, I would say, for example, I've traveled to a city like Thessaloniki, a Greek city. There's a museum, a Jewish museum there. And there we learn that the Jews who were expelled from Spain by the Catholics, the Ottomans welcomed them. And in time they thrived, so that in Thessaloniki, you see in that Jewish museum, you'll see proof that the Jewish population became the great entrepreneurs, the industrialists of the Ottoman Empire. They were given the contract to make the military clothing, the military suits, the uniforms for the Ottoman army. Now you can imagine, Raza, the thousands of soldiers and the contracts and how rich any industry would become. In Bosnia, which was also under the Ottomans, we talked to the Jewish community and its leaders like Ambassador Finci, and he said, we don't know the word anti-Semitism because we live here in complete harmony. And when the Muslims were in trouble in the mid 90s and there was genocide against the Muslims, he said, we reached out to the Muslims and we gave them food and shelter in our synagogues in Sarajevo. So you see these examples of interfaith harmony, and which are very inspiring, but not many people know about this aspect. This is an aspect of the Ottomans which still remains. And in some senses, this also we saw repeated in parts of India, where you had a synthesis between Hindu and Muslim culture, which unfortunately recently has been disrupted. But in South Asia, you have a very strong overlay of this Hindu-Muslim culture and the synthesis in some senses of this culture.
Yes, Dr. Saab, what a magisterial review you've given, and I'm so glad you brought up this idea of interfaith harmony during the Ottoman Empire, because that is something that the contemporary world has completely erased from public memory. I mean, I personally know of many Jewish families and individuals I've come across who were from Istanbul, and their ancestors had come to then, Ottoman Empire in the 16th, 17th centuries, when they were expelled from Spain and other parts, and even I think until recently, and now Turkey unfortunately is facing a lot of tumult as well. But until recently, until let's say the late 20th century, I mean, they were very much part of the fabric of even modern Turkish state. And this is something that we really have to remind. And I think this is one of the key features, because I mean, if you mentioned Suleiman the Magnificent and others, they're physicians, they're ministers, closest advisors, even generals, and other bureaucrats. I mean, the bureaucracy had so many Jewish people there. I mean, it was like, so this whole stereotype of Muslims hating the Jews and considering, being the enemies of Jews is completely undone if you spotlight on the Ottoman Empire. So I'm so glad you brought that. But Dr. Saab, also tell us a little bit about the Safavids. What happened to the Safavids? I mean, their decline. And what did it lead to? Obviously, we know that that's a prelude to modern Iran. And a little bit on that, and then we go, and then I'll pose you a final question so that we can wrap up this
The
session.
Safavid, Raza, as I said, is a shorter span. So they
Yeah.
begin around 1500 and they are very quickly established as a Shia dynasty. They very consciously promote themselves, and that leads them directly into conflict with their Sunni population, which at that stage is strong and Iranian, local, but that creates tension and conflict. And in the end, the choice for the Sunnis is either become Shia or migrate, or you're expelled. So it's not a very great story of tolerance and harmony, unfortunately. And this progress and the art and the culture and so on was created and continued in spite of this. So like Akbar with Fatehpur Sikri, Suleiman the Magnificent with Istanbul, and Mehmed the Conqueror with Istanbul, Abbas created a new center, and that was Isfahan. And
Yeah.
Isfahan was created specifically to move the centers of Iran, the Persian world, away from the Arab world. So previously it was Najaf and Karbala. So it was moved from there to Isfahan, which is a Persian city. So there was an emphasis on creating a Persian identity as distinct from an Arab Islamic dynasty. And the dynasty created a very, very interesting, as a sociologist, I find this very interesting, a kind of dynamic between rulers who are very powerful, very often debauched, lost in their own world of power and corruption, and religious scholars, genuine religious scholars, because Iranian society created an entire generation after generation of scholars of Islam, and these are highly trained Islamic scholars. Many of them became judges, many of them became writers, but they were very critical of the rulers. So you had this oscillation of power between the rulers in their palaces and the Islamic scholars. And this came to a head in the 17th century with Majlisi, who was a religious figure, and Majlisi toppled the ruler, and for a time he actually ruled Iran. Now you'll notice that this became the pattern that would be repeated by Imam Khomeini in the modern era, in the 20th century, where he would be critical of the Pahlavi, the emperor of the Shah of Iran, and he would topple him and take over power. So the tension between secular authority in the palaces and religious authority in the mosques and madrasas is the theme, I would say, of the Safavid. And of course, after the Safavid, you had various warlords, various tribes in conflict. You had the emergence of bandit chiefs like Nadir Shah, who emerged and who was as ruthless to his own people as he was to Delhi. As you know, he invaded Delhi, invaded India, and played havoc with Delhi. And then, of course, his one of his aides, Ahmad Shah Abdali, also did the same, came to Delhi and ransacked it, and then created a country for himself, modern Afghanistan, that comes out of Ahmad Shah Abdali's initiative, who's a great ruler, great man of art and culture and poetry. He's again a very impressive figure, but he's coming out of this turmoil and the disintegration of the Safavid Empire. So shorter than the other two, different in character, and because of the Sunni complex, they are constantly almost obsessed with the Sunnis, to the point that the rulers of Iran were constantly in touch with the enemies of the Ottomans in Europe. So they'd be writing to, say, an emperor in Europe and saying, look, why don't we team up against the Ottomans so that you contain the Ottomans and divert them to fight you rather than focus on us.
Right, right. Thank you. Again, very fascinating patterns, as you mentioned, how even that reverberates in modern Iran today. That's the tension, and that's been a conflict. So, if I were to sum up, the overall, all three, of course, had different trajectories, different characters, but there's a common underlying theme. Is they get into a glorious rise and ascent, and they conquer the world, they expand, and then there's the decline, and the decline is so much. It has to do when the rulers and the ruled start getting there's a disconnect, and then of course there's the encroachment of the rising colonial powers, particularly the British and the other European powers who were also clamoring. Ottoman Empire was for almost a century or more. They were being constantly eyed, as you mentioned at the start, by the Western European countries.
And Raza, when in the mid 60s, when I was at Cambridge, I saw that there was a tavern, a cafe, a little restaurant called the Turk's Head. And I was very interested. I said, why is it the Turk's Head? And they said, because we had a culture of centuries of fighting the Turks. So the Turk became the symbol of something negative, barbaric, outsider. And therefore you had the expression, the unspeakable Turk. And
Yes.
whether it's Shakespeare or Marlowe, they make fun of the Turk with contempt. So they admired the Turks, the Ottomans, but at the same time, they did not like them. And at the same time, they couldn't but help the immense cultural impact that Turkey had, the Ottomans had on Europe. For example, the tulip, which is now the symbol of Holland, the Dutch feel that this is their flower. That's a Turkish flower. That's a symbol of Turkey. Coffee, the croissant, the crescent, these are all coming from the Ottomans and their interaction with European culture. So yes, they are great examples. Now, we looking at that part of history are fascinated with all these stories of these rulers and these ups and downs of history, and there's these societies which are no longer with us. At the same time, we're also looking at them and saying, what lessons can we learn? And I think the great lessons, paradoxically, is what you pointed out, and that is the lesson of interfaith harmony, interfaith understanding. Paradoxically, because we are in the 21st century and we think now we've progressed so much, we've gone to the moon and we're aiming for Mars. At the same time, the violence against one another, you are seeing the violence throughout the world, literally throughout the world, between religions and cultures. And then we look at the time when we assume there should be that kind of violence because people are fighting each other on the basis of religion. And yet we are seeing these amazing examples. We've given some examples. We can give dozens of these examples of whether it's the Ottoman rulers or the Mughal rulers constantly reaching out and embracing the other.
Very, very appropriate summing up. And I think that brings us to the end of this particular episode. I hope that the viewers have liked this magisterial, grand narration of summing up so many centuries and strands and streams into a short time. But you can do that, Dr. Akbar Ahmed, and that's why I'm so happy that we are finally having this overdue conversation. So until the next time we meet, thank you once again and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Raza. Thank you.